For decades, Beatles fans and historians have tried to pinpoint who George Harrison truly couldn't stand. And let's be honest, the list of potential candidates is long. Was it a musical rival? A manager who promised the world and delivered? Dust? Many point to the usual suspects: business sharks, creative competitors, or just the sheer pressure of being a Beatle. But the truth is, the person who sparked Harrison's deepest and most lasting resentment wasn't some outsider. It was someone he saw almost every single day. This wasn't a feud with an enemy. It was a conflict at the very heart of his inner circle. It was the one person George felt consistently dismissed his talent, sidelined his growth, and contributed to an atmosphere that made him quit the world's biggest band. But this isn't a simple story of hate. Hate is too small a word for the complex cocktail of frustration, love, disappointment, and creative suffocation that define this relationship. To understand the man who became the focus of George's resentment, we can't just look at the moment the band fell apart. We have to go back to the beginning, to a dynamic that was set when they were just kids on a bus, chasing a dream that would become both their heaven and their hell. This is the story of how a creative partnership devolved into a power struggle, and how the quiet Beatle finally found his voice by standing up to the one man who, in his eyes, had tried for years to silence it: Paul McCartney. When George Harrison joined the Quarrymen in 1958, he was just a boy. At 15, he was the youngest member, brought in by his schoolmate Paul McCartney. John Lennon, nearly 3 years older, was the undisputed, sharp-tongued leader. Paul was the charming, musical prodigy. And George was the kid brother, the one who could peel off guitar licks nobody else could, a vital ingredient, but not yet an equal partner. This hierarchy, set in their teenage years, cast a long shadow over their entire career. Paul himself later acknowledged this dynamic, admitting that his seniority, only 8 months but a full year ahead in school, felt like a huge gap back then. He confessed to a habit of being bossy with George, a pattern born from that schoolboy pecking order. This little brother syndrome wasn't just a vibe, it shaped the creative process. In the early days, the songwriting machine was Lennon-McCartney. It was a brand, a partnership that shot the band into the stratosphere. George's role was clear: lead guitarist. His job was to add the flourishes and solos that made their songs shine. He was an interpreter, not a creator. For a while, that was enough. Beatlemania was an all-consuming whirlwind of screaming fans and global tours, leaving little time for grievances to fester. But as the band evolved, so did George. He was a sponge, soaking up everything from Carl Perkins to the intricate ragas of Ravi Shankar. He was growing, not just as a guitarist, but as a composer, and this is where the first real cracks started to show. His earliest songs, like Don't Bother Me, were a start, but they were often treated as novelties, a small concession to the junior partner. By the mid-60s, though, the quality of his songwriting was skyrocketing. He was creating something new, something uniquely his own. Yet inside the Beatles' creative bubble, he was still the kid brother. The Lennon-McCartney hit machine was a juggernaut, and there was simply very little room on any given album for a Harrison original. It became a familiar pattern. George would get 1, maybe 2, songs per record. It became a source of deep and growing frustration for him. He wasn't just writing good songs. He was writing great songs, songs that could stand shoulder to shoulder with his bandmates' best work. But he had to fight for every inch of vinyl. He famously lamented this dynamic, complaining that you'd have to wade through dozens of Paul's songs before he'd even consider one of yours. This wasn't just about ego, it was about artistic validation. George felt his own potential blooming, but believed he was being kept in a shoebox. More than anyone, Paul McCartney became the face of this creative gatekeeping. While John could be dismissive or just checked out, Paul took an active, directorial role in the studio. He was a perfectionist with a clear vision. In his mind, he was likely just steering the ship, maintaining quality control. But from George's perspective, it felt overbearing and condescending. It wasn't just that his songs were being sidelined. Even his musical ideas on other people's songs were often dismissed or dictated by Paul. This created a slow, burning resentment, a feeling of being perpetually undervalued. He was an artist desperate to paint, but someone else held the brushes. The period between 1965 and 1968 is when things get really interesting for George. He transformed from a competent songwriter into a true visionary. This creative explosion, however, ran headfirst into the very power structures that were trying to contain him, leading to a time of immense artistic growth and deep personal frustration. Rubber. Soul. In 1965 was a watershed moment. The album featured two of his compositions, the biting Think for Yourself and the shimmering, birds-inspired If I Needed Someone. That second song was so good that British chart toppers The Hollies covered it and released it as a single the very same day the album dropped. This should have been a moment of triumph. Instead, it became a flashpoint. Harisson publicly called The Hollies' version rubbish, sparking a minor feud in the press. The incident revealed something deeper about George, a fierce pride in his work and a sharp edge that defied his quiet persona. The following year on Revolver, Harisson delivered 3 songs, including an undisputed masterpiece, Taxman. Opening the album with a snarling indictment of the British government, the song was lyrically sharp, musically aggressive, and featured a blistering guitar solo, a solo, ironically and tellingly, played by Paul McCartney. While Paul's contribution was stellar, the fact that he played the lead on George's own track says a lot about the band's internal dynamics. Then came Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band in 1967. On what many consider the greatest album ever made, George had only one song, Within You Without You. While a stunning spiritual piece that served as the album's philosophical core, its solitary placement felt like a step back. It was becoming clear that no matter how good his songs were, he was always fighting for space against the Lennon-McCartney behemoth, and often against Paul's specific vision. The dam of his frustration finally started to break during the sessions for 1968's White Album. This is the record where George truly came into his own. He brought 4 incredible, diverse songs to the table: Long, 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 Piggies, Savoy Truffle, and one of the crown jewels of the entire Beatles discography, While My Guitar Gently Weeps. The story of that song is the perfect metaphor for George's struggle. He knew it was a classic. Yet, when he first presented it, the band's reaction was lukewarm. The initial takes were uninspired and didn't gel. Frustrated but undeterred, George took matters into his own hands and invited his friend Eric Clapton to play on the track. The presence of an outsider of Clapton's stature instantly changed the dynamic. Suddenly, everyone snapped to attention, giving the song the respect it deserved. The result was legendary, but for George, the victory was bittersweet. He had to bring in an outside legend just to get his own band to recognize the genius in their midst. This period was a paradox. George was writing some of the best music of his life, yet fighting the same old battles. A recently discovered tape from a September 1969 meeting lays the conflict bare. On it, Paul is heard admitting something to the effect of, "I thought, until this album Abbey Road, that George's songs weren't that good." George's reply was sharp. "That's a matter of taste. All down the line, people have liked my songs." This exchange reveals the core of the issue. For years, Paul seemed to genuinely view George's work as secondary. To George, this was a fundamental and deeply insulting artistic judgment. He had bloomed, but in the eyes of the man running the garden, he was still a lesser flower. If the previous years were a simmering fire, the cold, cavernous Twickenham film studios in January 1969 were the gasoline. The Get Back project was Paul's brainchild. He wanted to get the Beatles back to their roots, playing together as a live band. But his method, forcing the band into a sterile film studio under the harsh glare of cameras with a vague deadline, created a pressure cooker. For George, the situation was intolerable. He was creatively overflowing with songs, fresh from rewarding collaborations with musicians like Bob Dylan and the band, where he was treated as an equal. To come back to the old Beatle hierarchy under a microscope was soul-crushing. The atmosphere was toxic. John Lennon was often disengaged, his focus on Yoko Ono. This left a power vacuum that Paul, desperate to keep the band from falling apart, rushed to fill. He became the de facto director, pushing everyone to work. To George, it was years of being patronized coming to a head. Paul wasn't just suggesting chords, he was dictating exactly how George should play his parts. The infamous argument captured on film on January 6th has become the defining image of this era. As they rehearse Two of Us, the tension is thick. Paul, in a tone that's both patient and condescending, tries to instruct George. George, visibly irritated, finally snaps. "I'll play whatever you want me to play," he says, his voice seething with frustration. "Or I won't play at all if you don't want me to play. Whatever it is that will please you, I'll do it." It's a chilling moment. It's not a shouting match. It's the sound of a man's spirit breaking. He was essentially saying, "My art is meaningless to you, so just tell me what to do. I'll be the session man you've always treated me as." The final straw came 4 days later, on January 10th. After yet another clash over his songwriting, George Harrison quietly announced, "I'm leaving the band now," and walked out. In his diary that night, he wrote, "Got up, went to Twickenham, rehearsed until lunchtime. Left the Beatles." George didn't just go home and sulk. He channeled his frustration into his music. During his brief absence from the band, he wrote the song Wah Wah. The title was a double entendre, referring to the guitar pedal but also slang for a throbbing headache brought on by someone's complaining. The lyrics are a direct, scathing cry of liberation from the band's straitjacket. He was gone for 12 days. He only agreed to return under strict conditions. They had to abandon Twickenham and move to their own Apple studios. Crucially, Paul's grand plan for a big live concert had to be abandoned. They would finish the album, but on his terms. He had quit the biggest band in the world to save his own artistic sanity. And though he came back, the break was irreparable. He had stood up to Paul's control and taken the first real step toward his own freedom. George's return wasn't a joyful reunion. It was a fragile truce. The move to their Apple studio and the addition of keyboardist Billy Preston, at George's suggestion, helped smooth things over, but the deep wounds hadn't healed. The rest of the sessions, which would eventually become the Let It Be album and film, culminated in the famous rooftop concert. While that performance showed glimpses of their old magic, it was a swan song, not a rebirth. The band was now fractured into competing factions. This is where another key figure enters the story and throws fuel on the fire. Alan Klein. By 1969, the Beatles' finances were a mess. John Lennon, impressed by Klein's tough reputation, was adamant that he was the man to fix it. George and Ringo, weary of business squabbles, quickly agreed. For George, Klein was one of the first business figures to treat him like a star in his own right, a stark contrast to how he felt Paul treated him. Paul McCartney was vehemently opposed. He distrusted Klein and wanted his new father-in-law, Lee Eastman, to manage their affairs. To the other three, this looked like a power grab, an attempt by Paul to bring the band under his family's control. The battle over management became the final wedge that drove them apart. It was John, George, and Ringo with Klein on one side, and Paul with the Eastmans on the other. George's alignment against Paul was a clear act of defiance against the man he felt had dominated him for years. The band limped on to create one last magnificent album, Abbey Road. During these sessions, there was a professional detente. The quality of George's songs, Something and Here Comes the Sun, was undeniable. Even John and Paul had to admit George had reached their level. John called Something the best song on the album. For a fleeting moment, it seemed like they might find a new way to work. The September 1969 tape even reveals John proposing a new formula for their next album. 4 songs each from John, Paul, and George. But it was too little, too late. The poison from the Klein-Eastman feud was too potent. On April 10, 1970, Paul McCartney announced his departure, and the dream was over. For George, the breakup wasn't a tragedy, it was a release. It was an escape from the creative prison he felt he'd been in. Now, with a stockpile of brilliant songs that had been rejected or ignored, he was free to show the world, and Paul McCartney exactly what he could do. The end of the Beatles didn't extinguish George's resentment. It just let it burn in the open. His 1970 triple album, All Things Must Pass, was a monumental success. It was living proof that the songs not quite good enough for the Beatles were, in fact, timeless classics. The album's very existence was a statement to Paul. This is what you were holding back. But the most undeniable proof of George's feelings came a year later, on John Lennon's album, Imagine. The record featured one of the most vicious musical attacks in rock history, the song, How Do You Sleep? The track was a direct, cruel assault on Paul McCartney, and the man who supplied the searing slide guitar part was George Harrison. This wasn't a casual gig. This was George, standing with John, actively participating in a character assassination of their former bandmate. His presence on the song was a musical co-signature on every insult. Throughout the 70s, George rarely missed a chance to take a swipe at Paul in interviews. When asked in 1974 about a Beatles reunion, his response was clear. He said he'd join a band with John Lennon any day, but he couldn't join one with Paul McCartney, explaining it was a musical difference of opinion, but it was deeply personal. He often spoke of how Paul's overbearing nature had damaged his confidence, expressing how Paul's constant critiques and directions had chipped away at his instincts until he doubted his own abilities as a guitarist. He criticized Paul's solo work, too. When Paul released his 1984 film, Give My Regards to Broad Street, which featured many re-recordings of Beatles songs, George publicly questioned the artistic choice, suggesting Paul was relying on the past because he couldn't create a compelling future. Even his descriptions of Paul were double-edged, capturing the essence of his frustration. The talented, charismatic friend was also the domineering, controlling band leader. The man he'd known since he was a boy was also the man who had caused him the most creative anguish. For George, the ghost of Paul McCartney's authority lingered long after the band was gone. Of course, to paint this as pure hatred would be a disservice to their bond. It was a deeply human connection, full of contradictions. For all the talk of suppression, Paul made brilliant contributions to George's songs. On Taxman, Paul played the scorching guitar solo. He played the beautiful piano intro on While My Guitar Gently Weeps. And on Something, Paul crafted a bass line so inventive it's practically a song in its own right. These weren't the actions of a saboteur. They were the actions of a gifted musician collaborating. Also, much of what George saw as control can be viewed as Paul's desperate attempt to keep the Beatles from dissolving. As John pulled away and Ringo briefly quit, Paul took it upon himself to be the engine, the motivator. His methods were often clumsy, but his goal was arguably to save the band he loved. He was fighting for their survival the only way he knew. How? By taking charge. Even after the breakup, their shared history never vanished. It was more like a sibling rivalry than a war. As the bitterness of the 70s faded, their relationship softened. They found a way to be friends again. Paul would visit George at his Friar Park estate, and they'd spend time together, not as Beatles, but as two guys who'd known each other since they were kids. In later years, Paul spoke with deep admiration and regret about their dynamic. After George's passing in 2001, Paul's tributes were filled with genuine love. He often plays a ukulele version of something at his shows, a quiet, tender tribute to his friend. The resentment George felt was real and justified from his perspective, but it coexisted with a deep, complicated, brotherly bond. The conflict wasn't about a lack of love, it was about a clash of personalities. While the friction with Paul was a long-running saga, there is another man who earned a special, more venomous kind of hatred from George. This was a hatred born not of artistic differences, but of pure betrayal. That man was Allen Klein. Initially, Klein was George's champion. He treated George with a level of respect he felt Paul never had. Siding with Klein against Paul was George's declaration of independence. It was a decision he would deeply regret. The first red flag was the 1971 concert for Bangladesh. The groundbreaking charity event was George's passion project, but Klein's mismanagement of the finances was a disaster, causing massive tax liabilities and long delays in getting money to the refugees. But it was the My Sweet Lord lawsuit that cemented George's loathing. In 1971, Harisson was sued for copyright infringement, with a publisher called Bright Tunes claiming his hit subconsciously copied the song He's So Fine. At first, Klein, as George's manager, was on his side. By 1973, however, the other Beatles had fired Klein, and the relationship ended badly. That's when Klein showed his true colors. Seeing an opportunity for revenge and profit, he did something stunningly treacherous. He went behind George's back and bought Bright Tunes, the very company that was suing his former client. In an instant, Allen Klein became the plaintiff in the lawsuit against George Harisson. The man hired to protect George's interests was now actively trying to profit from his downfall. It was an incredible betrayal. A U.S. court would later call Klein's move a covert intrusion and a profound breach of his duty to Harisson. While the court did find that George had subconsciously plagiarized the song and had to pay damages, it was so appalled by Klein's conduct that it ruled Klein could not profit from his unethical breach of trust, limiting his recovery to only what he paid for the company. But the damage was done. For George, this was a violation far more personal than any argument over a guitar part. His conflict with Paul was about art. His war with Klein was about trust and deceit. It was a bitter lesson that forged an animosity that was pure and absolute. So who did George Harisson truly resent the most? The answer, like the man himself, is complex. If you're talking about pure, calculated betrayal, the title has to go to Allen Klein. Klein's actions were a stunning case of treachery, and the courts agreed. But if you're asking who was the source of George's most profound, consistent, and artistically crushing frustration, the evidence points overwhelmingly to Paul McCartney. The resentment towards Paul wasn't simple dislike. It was the agony of a brilliant artist who felt he was being held back. It was the daily friction of being treated like a junior partner long after he'd proven he was an equal. George's walkout, his participation in How Do You Sleep, his quotes for years after, they all point to a deep wound left by his creative battles with Paul. While George and Paul eventually found peace, the conflict defined George Harrison's artistic struggle and ultimately his liberation. It was by pushing against Paul's dominance that George found the strength to demand his own space. His resentment was the catalyst for his freedom. So while Allen Klein was a snake who bit him, Paul McCartney was the brother whose shadow he had to escape to finally find his own place in the sun. So what do you think? Was the creative suffocation from Paul McCartney a deeper wound than the outright betrayal by Allen Klein? Who do you think George Harisson truly resented the most? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this deep dive into rock and roll history, Be sure to like and subscribe for more stories behind the music.